Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Doris Mangrum, your host, and this is Stop the Madness, Practical Ways to Influence the Incarceration Crisis. I'm so excited today to have as my guest Dana Cheatum. She is a survivor. She is a motivational speaker. She is a certified life coach, and she's an amazing young woman who has lived an extraordinary life. Now, I, because of my background, really want to tell you the rest of her story. But I've always been told that you get the best story from the person whose story it is. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dana Cheatum, who is the founder and executive director of Total Woman Empowerment Coaching Incorporated. Welcome, Dana. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we've got a lot to cover.
Yes.
So we need to get right to it. And I'd like to start with kind of the beginning in terms of how you got to becoming the founder and executive director of Total Woman Coaching, Empowerment Coaching. Tell us a bit of your life story and how it evolved to today.
Well, Total Woman Empowerment was born while I was incarcerated. So I spent 26 years in prison, and when I talk about that, I don't like to talk about the actual 26 years. Let me just start this way, okay? October 24th, 1986, while under the influence of crack cocaine, I stabbed and killed a woman. That was the beginning of my end and the end of my beginning. I was 18 years old. I'd grown up in a really horrifically abusive home. Growing up, my mother told me I wasn't good enough. I wasn't born. I mean, I wasn't supposed to be here. She talked about how I was an accident. She talked about how she wished she would have closed her legs and smothered me at birth. So I kind of grew up with that thought process that I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to be born. But I loved my mother. Meanwhile, during that time frame, while I was growing up, my stepfather was very, very abusive to my mother. And this is a time when we've come to a place in society where domestic violence and abuse is not socially acceptable. But during that time, it was a part of the norm. It was socially acceptable. We talk about the rule of thumb, you know, so there was a joke that went with it. And so during this time, my stepfather was physically abusive to my mother on a continual basis. But I loved my mother, and I didn't want to see my mother harmed. And so I tried to protect her. There's one situation that comes to my mind. I was 8 years old. I had on hee-haw overalls. My stepfather had jumped on my mother really, really bad, and he left. And my mother had barricaded herself behind the couch. And when she came back, when he came back, she pulled a gun on him. And so he told her to put the gun down several times, and she didn't. And so my stepfather came and picked me up like I was a sack of potatoes. My head was pointing this way, my butt was pointing towards the back, and he had the dog leash in his left hand, and he lifted the dog leash, and he said to my mother, "Put the gun down." Well, because I had been accustomed to seeing my mother beat up and harmed by my stepfather, I was very aware of what he could do. And so I peed on myself. And he put me down, and he continued beating up my mother. And then when he was finished, he left. And then my mother told me to go clean myself up. I was an 8-year-old girl. I was afraid, I was scared. I had just used the bathroom on myself, and I needed to be tended to. That stayed in my spirit. Growing up in my home, there was the language that was spoke was the language of violence. And so that shaped my thought process. During the time my stepfather would beat my mother up, I would do whatever I could to protect her. I'd run out the house screaming. I'd call the police. I'd get stomach aches. I'd grab him, except I was small, and so he would fling me out the way. So growing up, I took on a role of protector, unknowing to myself. And I loved my mother. I loved my mother. And after my stepfather would beat my mother up, that was the time that I tended to her. Now, I'm an adult and I understand that I was her emotional support then, but I didn't understand that then. But during that time, she loved me. She talked to me. She tended to me. So I was important to her after that time frame. Meanwhile, years later, these things kind of deposited in me, and they shaped the way I thought. They shaped the way I engaged. They shaped the way I reacted. Many years later, under the influence of crack cocaine, as I said, I made a horrific decision. This decision it mirrored the way things had been in the home. The landlord at the time, my mother had this ongoing argument with the landlord, and this particular day my mother and the landlord was arguing, and she was saying to him, "I'm tired of you, I'll fight you, fight me." And so he said, his wife had came downstairs and she said, "I'll fight you, I'm not afraid of you." Well, at that time I had got out of the car, I had a knife, and I jumped in front of my mother and I stabbed the lady.
Let me ask you this. This is such a powerful story that you are weaving for us today, and such a transparent story that you are sharing. I'd like to go, as I'm listening to the beginning and the early years that caused you to end up behind the walls. This 26 years that you mentioned was a continuous 26 years. Is that correct?
Yes.
How did the things that you have just shared with us influence your time behind the walls, or did it influence it in any way? What were the kinds of things that helped you get through 26 years, and did the caregiving or support of your mother in any way have any influence on your time that you did on the inside, or what, if that was not the case, did have influence?
So, just want to make sure I heard you correctly. How did my growing up, my upbringing, influence my lifestyle while I was incarcerated?
Yes.
So, I didn't know that I had an upbringing that influenced my lifestyle. These things were as natural to me, feeling like I wasn't good enough, that I needed to protect people. These things were as natural to me as my skin, if that makes sense. So you don't know what you know until you know it. You don't know that that these things are not normal. You don't know that parents don't fight. You don't know that mothers don't tell their children, "You're not good enough. I wish I would have closed my leg." You don't know that these things are not natural, you know. And so when I got to prison, the cycle continued because I didn't know it was a cycle. And this is kind of where, like I was going initially, where Total Woman Empowerment was born. I didn't realize I was while I was in prison, I was just continuing on my merry way, being who I was, thinking distorted, being angry, manipulative, just all of the things that had been conceived in me and shaped in me when I was a child. They continued during my incarceration. While I was there, I started getting help. I started going to different programs. I started learning that the way I thought was not normal.
It's a different way.
I learned that I had experienced a lot of trauma. And the trauma served as a filter to me. It kind of served like sunglasses. And so when I talk to people, when I engage with people, that thing was, I was leading with my trauma. Let me go back a little bit.
Okay.
One of the things I didn't speak to is how my stepfather started raping me from 10 to 13. How I became a prostitute as a result. How I believed that because when my stepfather started raping me, the violence in my home diminished. It didn't stop, but it diminished. And the thing that was significant was I was protecting my mother. Even though it wasn't my intent, but it stopped him from hurting my mother. And I needed my mother to love me. That filter I talk about, that trauma, I believe that there was a connection where I felt like this was the acceptance, this was the love. So I led with needing to be needed, needing to be accepted, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
So going back to the birth of Total Woman Empowerment, as I began to learn more about how I got there, it was like, I don't have to stay trapped in this trauma. I don't have to stay trapped in this situation. I can be free. God began to lead me to different programs, and he began to lead me to church. And then I began to know who I was in him. And then I felt like other people need to know. I remember waking up in prison, and not waking up out the bed, but waking up realizing, oh my God, where am I and how did I get here? And it was kind of like the Katrina. You know, when I woke up, the waters of depression and the waters of self-doubt and low self-esteem had consumed me. And I needed help. But I was so contaminated from the things that were on the inside and that trauma that filled me that I couldn't even get help. The people that loved me couldn't even help me because that's how harmful I was. But then I was able to see a way out through going to church and so forth.
So that turning point then, as I'm listening to your, there was a turn.
Yes.
And in that turn, you then have decided now that you want to focus your life on helping people, helping women whose lives have collided with the criminal justice system, recreate themselves, reclaim.
Yes.
Because that's what I'm hearing from you, that you reclaimed, that you dug in and changed the way you wanted to move and take your path and your journey, if you will. So talk to our viewers a bit about this transition and what Total Woman Empowerment Coaching does for the women who enter your program, and what's involved in it and what they can expect to get or gain from your program.
So Total Woman Empowerment offers insight to women who's been affected by trauma. So oftentimes society will look at the manifestations of trauma, such as substance abuse or mental health or incarceration. Total Woman Empowerment speaks to the woman and helps her understand how her trauma leads to self-destructive behaviors, which includes substance abuse and incarceration and social poverty. And it helps her understand so I don't teach that you have to go back into that situation. What I talk about and what I teach is that it's important to recognize the writing on the wall, or to classify and label, as if we were walking down a corridor and we're trying to figure out where we're going. It's important for me to see the bathroom. It's important for me to see the janitor's room. I have to know where I'm going. So when we're looking at how we got to where we are, we must be willing to identify those things that serve as a filter, that serve to direct the way we move and the way we talk. And so I offer workshops where women, they're interactive, so I'm not doing a lot of talking to you. You are engaging with an exercise where even if you're not talking, because sometimes women are not comfortable sharing those things, you are engaging with that activity and you're processing. I do an activity called Makeup. And it involves identifying what you show to the world, but what others don't see. For instance, one of the things I showed to the world was my sexuality. I remember telling relationships, well, not telling them, but being sexually having sex really quick, being very promiscuous and having sex really quick. But what they didn't see was I felt like that's all I had to offer. And so what I showed people was my sexuality, my sex appeal and all this. What they didn't see was I didn't think that there was any worth. That was all I had to offer. And once they got to know me, they wouldn't like me. And that was my trauma, leading with my trauma and filtering my engagements. So the exercise, once you identify that, then you become one with it. I'm not just a sexual being. No, and my worth is not in my sexuality. And at the end of the exercise, I encourage the women to take off the makeup. I actually hand them a wet wipe. Today, we're going to make a declaration.
The mask.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're going to take off the makeup. That's one of the exercises I do. Another exercise is where I have you actually put on a drawstring backpack, and throughout the exercise, the things that come up, I just want you to put it inside the backpack, because it's important for you to see how our issues, if we will, contort us and weigh us down. And so now what do you want to do about it?
And so now with these, what sounds like amazing exercises that you take the participants through, what is some of the progress that you have seen? I know from my work that being confined, whether it be behind the walls or being confined by something that you believe that is untrue about yourself, whatever that confinement is, causes a loss of confidence. What is some of the progress that you have seen as a result of those women who have participated in your program, coming from whatever level of trauma that they may have, to change their lives and to improve? And then I want you to speak to your transition after coming out after 26 years, but speak to that first.
So I had a woman who had been a prostitute, and the guy that she had been engaging had actually hit her over the head and caused her to have an aneurysm. So when she came to the workshop and when she came to me, she was so broken, and she felt like that was all she was worth. And this particular person, that was all she would ever amount to. That's all she would get. That was the best she could do. And so going through the program, she was able to see how she got to a place where she thought she was a prostitute. where she thought the only thing that she had value, that was of value to, was her sexuality. And that was all her worth. Anyway, going through the workshop, taking off those masks, identifying how she got there, she was able to come off the street, get her children back, get her own apartment, is now working, thriving, taking care of her children, and just doing amazing things. Actually coming back to the workshops and telling that piece of her, you know. Wow,
that's amazing. As I hear you talk about transitioning, I am aware, and I've not lived it, but I am aware of the transition from confinement to quote unquote freedom is not as easy as the words flow, because freedom truly coming from behind the walls to society is not that. You know, the setback of housing, jobs, just interfacing not only with others but interfacing with yourself, this broad world that you now have to try to navigate through. So talk to our viewers about what it's like. It's hard, I can imagine, coming back after 6 weeks or 26 weeks. But we're talking 26 continuous years. So much has changed, not just the way it looks and the way we operate in the world, but for you as an individual, what were some of the difficulties or challenges that you had to navigate through to get to Dana Cheatum that I see sitting before me today?
You know, and that's really a process. That's a big process, and it doesn't start the day you get out. During my incarceration, I had someone tell me, I hope you get your life together before your son realizes how much effort you're putting into staying in prison. And that was a major wake-up call for me.
Wow.
And at that time, the Lord began to direct me to different programs, like I had mentioned earlier. I ended up getting my AA degree while I was incarcerated, because now I wanted to leave. Now I believed I could leave. There was hope in my life.
Absolutely.
And so I began to prepare for tomorrow while I was yet in my today. So I got my AA degree. I started working in a substance abuse program. It was
on the
called,
inside?
Yes.
Okay.
It was called the Substance Abuse Program, SAP. And I became a mentor there. And I realized that's what I was supposed to do, that everything I had ever experienced was not about me, but it was about being a bridge to somebody else. And that's where Total Women Empowerment began to be born. And so you have to go to the parole board. And so I went to the parole board after 5 times of being denied. And I was found suitable for parole. September 20th, 2012, I paroled after 26 years of prison.
Wow.
It was a day I had dreamed of. And I didn't even need to pinch myself, because the sun shined brighter. The air felt fresher, smelled fresher, and the water felt wetter. I knew I was not dreaming. And I was so excited. But I was scared. I was scared. I was scared that I wasn't going to make it. I was scared that I was institutionalized. I was scared because all of the people that I had left, many had died. My mother had died. My grandmother had died. My son, who was 18 months old when I left, was 24. Actually, not 24. He was older. I don't remember how old he was. I just know he was older. And life had changed. In 1986, there was no technology. But technology was born and was huge. So when I got out, I was very petrified. I was afraid. I would be walking around, I would see people walking around talking to themselves. That was weird. Walking around
still
trying to, yes. Now, I mean, I know they're on their cell phone, but it was weird. I would have to dodge people because they were so busy texting. So, and this was this was overwhelming.
To go from confinement
yes.
to here it is.
Yes, and so I went into Walmart to use a bathroom, and I had went to wash my hands, and there was no knobs. And there was no one in the bathroom so that I could watch to follow, you know. And I stood there and started crying because I didn't know what to do. But I had this internal argument in my head saying, okay, this is not the time to cry. Figure it out. Get it together. And so I did. I started adjusting, trying to move the faucet and touching. And then the water eventually came on.
Yes.
But I wouldn't have been able to do it twice. And so this lady, the counselor who had took me, asked me what was wrong. And I said in this really childlike voice, there was no knobs. And so what I realized is that you don't know what you don't know until you know what you don't know, if that makes sense.
Yes, it absolutely makes sense.
And so I didn't know what question to ask because I didn't know what I needed to know. Right.
You know, I hate to break you in midstream, but there is so much more that we're going to have from you. I can already tell that I'm going to need you to come back because we only have a little bit of time left, believe it or not. We're coming to the end of our time. And we've not even talked about the new project that you started. We've not even talked about the impact, not only on yourself, but on people in general who return home. So I'm hoping that you're going to be willing to come back and finish up and we talk more about, you know, your journey after you've gotten on the outside of those walls and how you are not coming out bitter, but also are coming out with a positive outlook, because what you're saying and what you're doing is going to resonate with so many people. And it's just been an honor to just sit back in awe of who I see and what I hear based upon what the beginning of your story was all about. So quickly, we have about a moment left to tell us about the new project in as succinct a manner as you can. So before we wrap up.
And so one of the things I was talking about is just paroling after 26 years and the trauma of that, and then going into a program that was geared towards women who had severe addiction problems, but not towards helping a woman transition after that long. And so basically Total Woman Empowerment has created home, healing, home free, healing, opportunity, mentorship, elevation free for the woman who has paroled after 26 years. The home has been created by women who has paroled off of a life sentence, who know what you need, what a woman paroling off of a life sentence needs. And so that's what we're doing. That's the project we're working on now, but we certainly could use your support, volunteers. If you're interested in knowing more about it, you could certainly give me a call and I could tell you all about it.
Okay, and what is that number that people can call?
That number would be 559-493-0263.
And that's going to have to do it for us today. Thank you so much, Dana. You have been such a joy to sit and listen to. I heard two things from you: transparency and dedication. And that's important for all of us, because in order to be a positive force, we need to be as transparent as we're able to be. And we need to be dedicated to our causes, to believe that we can see the end of reaching our objectives and our life goals. And I believe, as I say always, that you have embodied this. And as I close, my mantra is go out and make this a great day, do something good for someone else. And so I implore you today, go out, make this a great day, do something good for someone else. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're amazing.
Thank you.